The morning sun cast long shadows across the ruins of Arkan's ancient capital, its golden rays filtering through the skeletal remains of what had once been magnificent towers. Dr. Lena Korath knelt beside a partially collapsed wall, her gloved hands carefully brushing away centuries of accumulated dust and debris. The archaeological site stretched endlessly before her, a testament to the devastating war that had consumed this world for nearly 100 years before the peace accords were finally signed. Arkan had been reborn from its ashes, but the scars remained. Beneath the modern city that now thrived above lay layer upon layer of history, each stratum telling the story of conflict, destruction, and eventual reconciliation. As the lead archaeologist for the Historical Preservation Commission, Lena had spent the better part of 3 years methodically excavating this particular sector, uncovering artifacts that would help future generations understand the true cost of war. The underground tunnels and bunkers that honeycombed the earth beneath her feet had once served as shelters, command centers, and hiding places for both soldiers and civilians. Now, they were time capsules preserving moments in amber that spoke to the resilience and tragedy of those who had lived through the darkest period in Arkan's history. Lena's team worked in careful silence around her, each member focused on their assigned grid sections. The work was painstaking and methodical. Every fragment of metal, every piece of fabric, every personal item had to be cataloged and preserved. It was more than just archaeology. It was an act of remembrance for those who had given their lives in service of ideals that seemed increasingly distant with each passing year. As she worked her way deeper into a collapsed alcove that appeared to have once been part of a communications bunker, Lena's trowel struck something solid. The metallic ring echoed through the confined space, causing her to pause and examine the obstruction more carefully. What she uncovered made her breath catch in her throat. It was a battle helmet, its surface dented and scarred by combat, but remarkably well preserved considering its age. The metal bore the distinctive markings of Arkan's old military forces before the reorganization that had come with peace. But it was what she found inside that helmet that changed everything. Etched into the inner lining in careful, deliberate script were 4 words that seemed to defy everything she thought she knew about the war's conclusion: "Find me. I'm alive." Lena sat back on her heels staring at the message in disbelief. According to all historical records, the final battle had taken place exactly 103 years ago. Every soldier who had participated was accounted for either confirmed dead, officially missing and presumed dead, or among the small number of survivors who had lived to see the peace accord signed. The idea that someone could have survived in secret for over a century was impossible. Yet here was the message undeniably real, carved with the desperation of someone who believed they would be found. She carefully photographed the helmet and its inscription before gently lifting it from its resting place. Beneath it, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow protected it from the elements, was a small leather journal. With trembling fingers, Lena opened it to reveal page after page of cramped handwriting entries that began during the final months of the war and continued far beyond any date that should have been possible. The first entry was dated 3 days before the official end of hostilities. "Command has abandoned us. The peace talks proceed as if we don't exist, as if our sacrifice means nothing. They want this war to end cleanly with no loose ends, no inconvenient truths to complicate their new world. But I won't disappear quietly. If I survive this, I'll find a way to tell the real story." The entries continued becoming increasingly desperate as the author described being cut off from his unit, witnessing atrocities that had been covered up, and eventually making the decision to go underground, literally. The final entries spoke of a network of survivors, hidden beneath the city, keeping the truth alive, even as the world above chose to forget. Lena's hands shook as she read. If these entries were authentic, they represented evidence of a massive cover-up that had shaped the very foundation of Arkan's peaceful society. The Truth Council, the governing body responsible for maintaining historical records and ensuring that the lessons of the past were never forgotten, had apparently done the opposite. They had buried inconvenient truths to preserve their version of peace. She knew she should report the find to her supervisors immediately. Protocol demanded it. But something in the desperate tone of those journal entries, in the carefully carved message inside the helmet, made her hesitate. The author had trusted that someday someone would find his message and take action. The question was, what kind of action was she prepared to take? That evening, Lena sat in her small apartment overlooking the modern district of New Arkin, the helmet and journal spread across her dining table. She had photographed every page, created digital copies of every entry, but she hadn't yet filed her official report. The weight of decision pressed down on her, like the tons of earth that had buried the helmet for over a century. Her comm unit chimed, indicating an incoming message. The sender's name made her pause. Thane Morrison, investigative journalist for the Arkin Free Press. She had met him briefly at a conference on post-war reconstruction, but they had barely spoken beyond professional pleasantries. His message was short and intriguing. Dr. Korath, I understand you made an interesting discovery today. We should talk. Tomorrow 2 p.m. the Memorial Gardens. Come alone and bring whatever you found. Lena stared at the message, her mind racing. How could he possibly know about the helmet she had told no one, filed no reports? Unless someone had been monitoring her excavation site. The thought sent a chill down her spine. She spent a sleepless night wrestling with her options. By morning, she had made her decision. She would meet with Morrison and see what he knew. But she would also take precautions. The Memorial Gardens occupied a peaceful corner of the city center, where sculptured remembrances of the war's victims stood among carefully tended flowers and reflecting pools. Lena arrived early, carrying a small bag that contained digital copies of the journal entries and photographs of the helmet. The originals remained safely hidden in her apartment. Thane Morrison was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with the lean build of someone who had spent time in active military service. When he approached her bench beside the memorial of unknown soldiers, she could see old scars on his hands and a slight limp in his left leg that spoke of combat experience. Dr. Korath, he said, settling beside her with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to clandestine meetings. Thank you for coming. How did you know about yesterday's discovery? She asked, without preamble. I have sources within the excavation teams, he replied. People who believe the public has a right to know what's being uncovered, even when their supervisors disagree. And what makes you think my supervisors would disagree? Thane's expression grew serious. Because I've been investigating the Truth Council for 3 years, and every time someone uncovers evidence that contradicts their official narrative, that evidence mysteriously disappears. Projects get shut down, archaeologists get reassigned to distant sites, and findings that might upset the delicate balance of our peace suddenly become classified. Lena studied his face, looking for signs of deception or fanaticism, but found only the earnest determination of someone who had seen too much to remain silent. What exactly do you think I found? Evidence that the war didn't end as cleanly as we've been told. Evidence that people were abandoned, betrayed, or, worse, deliberately silenced to preserve the peace process. She reached into her bag and withdrew a tablet containing the digital copies. Before I show you this, I need to know, what's your interest in this? Why risk your career chasing conspiracy theories? Thane was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the memorial statue before them. I was there during the final battles, he said finally. Young, barely 18, convinced I was fighting for something noble. I saw things that didn't make it into the official reports. Good soldiers who were listed as missing when I saw their bodies myself. Orders that came down to clean up sites where civilians had been caught in crossfire. When I came home and started reading the sanitized version of events, I realized that our peace was built on a foundation of lies. That's a serious accusation. It's about to become a lot more serious. Lena handed him the tablet, watching his expression as he scrolled through the photographs and journal entries. His face grew increasingly grim as he read, and when he reached the final entries, his hands clenched into fists. "Victor Ashford," he whispered. "You recognize the name? He was my commanding officer's superior, officially listed as killed in action during the final push on the northern strongholds. But," he paused, his face pale, "there were rumors among the enlisted men. Stories about senior officers who had gotten too close to evidence of war crimes, who started asking the wrong questions." "What kind of war crimes?" Thane glanced around the memorial garden, ensuring they weren't being observed. "Systematic elimination of witness populations. Destruction of evidence. The official story says the final battles were clean military engagements, but the reality was much uglier. There were civilian casualties that were covered up, prisoner executions that were never reported, entire communities that were relocated and then disappeared." Lena felt the world shifting around her. The peaceful society she had grown up in, the carefully maintained narrative of honorable war and just peace, was beginning to crumble in her mind. If Victor Ashford is still alive, if he's been hiding for over a century, then he knows where the bodies are buried, literally and figuratively. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of implications settling over them like a shroud. Finally, Thane spoke again. "The journal mentions a network of survivors' hidden facilities beneath the city. If we're going to find him, we'll need to trace those references, map out the underground systems that existed during the war." "That's dangerous territory," Lena said. "The old tunnel networks extend into areas that are now classified as environmental hazard zones. Acid swamps from chemical weapons, radiation from tactical nuclear strikes, unstable structures that could collapse without warning." "I know," Thane replied. "I've done some exploration in those areas before. Unofficially, of course." "Why would you risk that?" "Because someone needs to tell the truth, even if it's a century too late." Lena made her decision in that moment, though she wouldn't fully understand its implications until much later. The journal references coordinates landmark descriptions. If we cross-reference them with pre-war maps and geological surveys, we might be able to locate some of these hidden facilities. I'm an archaeologist, Thane. Finding things that have been lost is what I do." Over the following week, they worked in secret to decode the clues hidden within Victor Ashford's journal. Lena used her academic access to historical archives and geological surveys, while Thane contributed his knowledge of military installations and tactical networks from his service years. What emerged was a picture of an extensive underground system that had been deliberately erased from official records. The breakthrough came when Lena discovered that several of the landmarks mentioned in the journal corresponded to locations that were now part of the environmental exclusion zone areas, declared too dangerous for civilian access following the war. According to official records, these zones contained only the poisoned remnants of battlefields and the ruins of military installations. But Victor's journal suggested otherwise. "Look at this," Lena said, spreading a composite map across Thane's apartment floor. "He mentions the Guardian Falls where the earth bleeds silver. I initially thought it was metaphorical, but if you overlay the old mining survey maps..." Thane knelt beside her, following her finger as she traced the route. "There's a waterfall in Sector 7 of the exclusion zone near where the old silver mines were flooded during the chemical bombardments. The journal says the entrance is behind the falls, concealed by what he calls the Weeping Stone. It could be a natural cave system that was adapted for military use. Sector 7 is deep in the acid marsh zone," Thane warned. "The water table was contaminated by chemical weapons. Even with protective gear, we'd be taking serious risks. The journal suggests there are safe passages routes that bypass the worst contamination. Victor and his people have been using them for decades." Thane studied the map for several minutes, his expression thoughtful. "We'll need specialized equipment. Chemical suits, radiation detectors, emergency oxygen supplies. And we'll need to move at night to avoid the surveillance drones that patrol the exclusion zones." "Can you get that kind of equipment?" "I have contacts among the freelance salvage crews. They work the outer edges of the exclusion zones, recovering valuable materials. They won't ask questions if the price is right." 3 days later, they stood at the edge of the exclusion zone, as the sun set behind the twisted remains of what had once been a thriving industrial district. The landscape before them was a nightmare of poisoned earth and toxic water where nothing natural could survive. The acid marshes stretched for kilometers, their surface occasionally disturbed by bubbles of noxious gas that rose from the chemical sludge below. Their protective suits were bulky and uncomfortable but necessary for survival in this wasteland. Thane led the way, following coordinates derived from the journal, while constantly monitoring their radiation exposure and air quality. The route they followed skirted the worst of the contamination, using elevated pathways and natural ridges that remained relatively safe. The first night of travel was exhausting, but uneventful. They made camp in the ruins of what appeared to have been a research facility, its concrete walls providing protection from the toxic atmosphere outside. As they sat in their temporary shelter, sharing ration packs and checking their equipment, Lena couldn't help but wonder what they would find at the end of their journey. "Do you think he's really still alive?" she asked. Thane was quiet for a moment, adjusting the settings on his radiation detector. "The journal entries are too detailed, too specific to be fabrications. Someone with intimate knowledge of the war's final days wrote those words. Whether it's Victor Ashford or someone else, we're going to find answers. And if the Truth Council discovers what we're doing, then we'd better find those answers quickly." The second day brought new challenges as they entered the radioactive forest zone, where the trees had been twisted into grotesque shapes by nuclear fallout and chemical contamination. The undergrowth glowed with an eerie phosphorescence that was both beautiful and terrifying, marking the locations where the most dangerous materials had settled into the soil. Following the journal's directions, they navigated through this surreal landscape, using landmarks that had survived the decades of environmental destruction. A distinctive rock formation here, a metal structure there, guideposts, left by someone who had traveled this route many times before. As they climbed higher into the foothills that bordered the exclusion zone, the contamination levels began to decrease, and they could hear the sound of falling water in the distance. According to the journal, they were close to their destination. The waterfall was exactly as Victor had described it, a silver ribbon of water cascading down a cliff face, stained with mineral deposits that caught and reflected the afternoon light. The pool at its base was surprisingly clear, suggesting that the water source was clean, despite the surrounding contamination. "The entrance should be behind the falls," Lena said, consulting the journal one more time. "He mentions a passage that can only be accessed when the water level is low." They waited until evening, when the waterfall's flow decreased to a mere trickle. As the sun set, they could see the dark opening that had been concealed behind the falling water, exactly as the journal had promised. The cave entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for a single person, but it opened into a larger chamber that had been clearly modified by human hands. Ancient support beams held back the weight of stone above, and the walls bore tool marks that spoke of careful excavation. This was no natural formation. Their headlamps illuminated a passage that extended deep into the mountain, following what appeared to be a natural fault line. The air was surprisingly fresh, suggesting a ventilation system that drew clean air from somewhere above. Someone had spent considerable time and effort making this place habitable. As they descended deeper into the mountain, they began to encounter signs of recent habitation. Electric cables snaked along the walls, connecting to battery packs and solar collectors that must have been hidden on the surface. Storage alcoves contained supplies that were clearly modern water purification tablets, preserved foods, medical supplies. "Someone's been maintaining this place," Thane observed, examining a first aid kit that bore a manufacture date from just 2 years earlier. "The question is who," Lena replied, "and whether they're still here." They got their answer an hour later, when their passage opened into a vast underground chamber that took their breath away. The space had been carved from the living rock and expanded over decades, creating a subterranean complex that could house dozens of people. Solar panels positioned at carefully concealed surface locations provided power for a sophisticated life support system that included air filtration, water purification, and climate control. But it was the chamber's inhabitants that truly shocked them. A dozen men and women ranging in age from their 40s to what appeared to be well over a century looked up from their activities as the two intruders entered their hidden sanctuary. Their clothes were simple, but well-maintained, their faces bearing the weathered look of people who had spent decades in hiding. And standing at the center of the group, despite his apparent age, was a man whose bearing and presence immediately identified him as their leader. His hair was white as snow, his face lined with the accumulated weight of years, but his eyes burned with the intensity of someone who had never abandoned his mission. "You found my message," he said, his voice carrying the authority of command, despite the passage of time. "I wondered if anyone ever would." "Victor Ashford?" Lena asked, though she already knew the answer. "Colonel Victor Ashford, formerly of the 3rd Heavy Infantry Division," he replied with a slight smile. "Though I haven't used that rank in over a century." The reality of the situation began to sink in as Victor and his companions shared their story. They were indeed survivors of the war's final battles, but not in the way Lena had expected. They were refugees from their own side, soldiers and civilians who had witnessed atrocities committed in the name of achieving peace, who had been marked for elimination because their testimony would have complicated the carefully negotiated end to hostilities. The peace accords required certain inconvenient truths to be buried, Victor explained, as they sat around a table carved from the mountain stone. Entire populations had been displaced or eliminated to create clean borders. War crimes had been committed by all sides, but acknowledging them would have made reconciliation impossible. "So you were sacrificed for the greater good," Thane said, his voice bitter with understanding. "Not just us," replied Maria Santos, a woman in her 70s, who had been a medic during the final campaigns. Entire units were disbanded and their members reassigned to classified operations that were actually elimination details. Anyone who had seen too much, who might ask awkward questions during the truth and reconciliation process, simply disappeared. "We were supposed to die in the final assault on the Kepler fortress," added another survivor, a man named David Kim, who still bore the scars of chemical weapons exposure. "Our own commanders gave us false intelligence, led us into an ambush that was designed to wipe us out. We only survived because Victor suspected something was wrong and prepared an escape route." Victor nodded grimly. "I had been questioning certain orders, investigating reports that didn't match what we were seeing on the ground. When I started asking the wrong people the wrong questions, I was quietly reassigned to lead what I later realized was meant to be a suicide mission." "But you survived," Lena said. "We all survived, though barely. And we've been down here ever since, preserving the evidence that others wanted destroyed, keeping the truth alive, even when the world above chose to forget." The evidence they had preserved was staggering. Detailed records of atrocities committed by all sides during the war's final stages. Testimony from witnesses who had since been officially listed as dead. Photographs and video recordings of sites that had been cleaned up and sanitized before the peace commissions could investigate them. "Why didn't you come forward after the war ended?" Lena asked. "Why remain hidden?" Victor's expression darkened. "We tried. 3 of our number attempted to make contact with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the early years after the peace accords. They never returned. We learned later that they had been arrested as war criminals and executed after secret trials. The new government couldn't afford to have its foundation questioned," Maria added. "Too many powerful people had committed crimes that needed to remain buried. Too many convenient lies had become the basis for peace treaties and reconstruction efforts." As the hours passed, Lena and Thane listened to story after story of betrayal, cover-up, and the systematic elimination of inconvenient witnesses. The peaceful society they had grown up in had indeed been built on a foundation of lies, but those lies ran deeper and were more pervasive than either of them had imagined. "So what happens now?" Thane asked as dawn approached outside their underground sanctuary. "You've kept this evidence for over a century. What do you plan to do with it?" Victor smiled sadly. "We're old, my friend. Most of us won't live to see another decade. We've been waiting for someone like you. Someone with the means and the motivation to carry our story to the world above. The Truth Council will never allow it, Lena protested. They have too much invested in maintaining the official narrative. Then, we'll have to find a way around them. Thane replied, his journalist's instincts already working on the problem. Social media, independent news networks, direct action that forces them to respond. Victor reached into a storage chest and withdrew a device that Lena recognized as an old military recording unit. This contains my complete testimony recorded over the past 100 years. Everything I witnessed, everyone who was betrayed, every crime that was covered up. If this reaches the public, it will shake the foundations of our society. Are you prepared for that? Lena asked. Are you ready to destabilize the peace that has lasted for a century? Peace built on lies isn't really peace, Victor replied. It's just delayed justice. The families of those who were murdered deserve to know the truth. The survivors who were branded as traitors deserve vindication. And the young people of today deserve to understand the real cost of the prosperity they've inherited. The decision to act came when their underground sanctuary was discovered by Truth Council security forces 3 days later. Lena and Thane had been preparing to leave with copies of Victor's evidence when motion sensors detected approaching vehicles on the surface above. The sanctuary's hidden nature had been compromised, whether through surveillance of their own activities or through infiltrators within Victor's group. They would never know. The assault came without warning. Heavily armed security forces descended through concealed entrances that Victor's people had never discovered their presence, indicating a level of preparation that suggested they had been planning this operation for some time. The Truth Council had finally decided that the underground survivors represented too great a threat to ignore. The battle that followed was brief, but intense. Victor's people were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had the advantage of knowing every passage and chamber in their mountain stronghold. What ensued was a running fight through tunnels and caverns that had been their home for decades. Lena found herself pressed against the wall of a side passage as energy weapons fire filled the air with deadly light. Thane crouched beside her, checking the charge on the recording device that contained Victor's testimony. Around them, the sound of combat echoed through the stone corridors as people who had already given up everything for the truth made their final stand. "We have to get this out," Thane shouted over the noise of battle. "Whatever happens here, Victor's story has to reach the public." "The main exit is blocked," Lena replied, consulting a map of the tunnel system that one of the survivors had pressed into her hands. "But there's an emergency passage that leads to the old mine workings. We might be able to reach the surface from there." As they prepared to make their escape, Victor appeared beside them, his ancient rifle in his hands and determination written across his weathered features. "The recording device you carry contains more than just my testimony," he said. "There are contact codes for other survivor networks, other groups who have been preserving evidence of the truth. This is bigger than just our little sanctuary." "Other networks?" Lena asked in amazement. "Did you think we were the only ones who survived? The only ones who refused to accept the official lies?" Victor smiled grimly. "We've been building connections for decades, creating a web of truth that spans the entire planet. Today's battle is just the beginning." Before either of them could respond, Victor pressed a small device into Lena's hands. "Emergency beacon," he explained. "When you reach the surface, activate it. Our allies will find you." That was the last time they saw him alive. The emergency passage proved to be a nightmare journey through partially collapsed mine shafts and flooded chambers, but it brought them to the surface several kilometers from the mountain stronghold. Behind them, they could see the glow of fires and the flash of energy weapons as the battle continued in the depths. When they finally emerged into the dawn light, they were met by people they had never seen before, men and women who identified themselves as part of the survivor network Victor had mentioned. The underground resistance to the Truth Council's monopoly on history was far more extensive than either Lena or Thane had imagined. The leader of their rescue team was a woman named Elena Vasquez, whose calm competence suggested military training. "Victor got a message out before the assault began," she explained, as they made their way to a concealed vehicle. "He said you were carrying something that could change everything." Victor's testimony. Thane confirmed, clutching the recording device. "Evidence of war crimes and cover-ups going back over a century." "Then we need to get it to the broadcast center immediately," Elena replied. "We've been preparing for this moment for years." The broadcast center turned out to be a sophisticated facility, hidden beneath what appeared to be an ordinary commercial building in downtown New Arkan. The Survivor Network had spent decades infiltrating every level of society, establishing safe houses, communication networks, and the technical infrastructure needed to bypass the Truth Council's control of information. As technicians worked to prepare Victor's testimony for broadcast, Lena found herself struggling with the magnitude of what they were about to unleash. The revelations would shatter the carefully maintained peace that had defined her entire life. Families would learn that their honored dead had actually been murdered by their own commanders. Government officials would be exposed as accomplices to genocide. The very foundations of Arkan society would be called into question. "Having second thoughts?" Thane asked, noting her expression. "I keep thinking about the consequences," she admitted. "What happens to our society when people learn that everything they've been told about our history is a lie?" "The same thing that happens to any society that's forced to confront uncomfortable truths," Elena interjected. "It grows up. It becomes stronger. It learns to build peace on truth instead of on convenient fictions." The broadcast began at noon, transmitted simultaneously through dozens of independent networks that the Survivor Coalition had established over the years. Victor's voice, aged but strong, began to tell his story to a world that had tried to forget him. He spoke of orders to eliminate civilian populations who had witnessed military atrocities. He described the systematic assassination of officers who had questioned the increasingly brutal tactics employed in the war's final stages. He presented evidence of mass graves that had been secretly relocated to prevent their discovery by peace commissions. The impact was immediate and devastating. Within hours, crowds had gathered in the streets outside government buildings, demanding answers from officials who had spent their entire careers defending the official narrative. Social media exploded with testimonials from families who had long suspected that their missing relatives' deaths had been covered up. The Truth Council's initial response was to denounce the broadcast as terrorist propaganda, but their credibility crumbled as more survivor networks emerged from hiding, each contributing additional evidence that corroborated Victor's testimony. Documents that had been hidden for decades were released. Photographs that had never been published were shared across every available platform. By evening, emergency sessions of the Planetary Parliament had been called. Government ministers who had built their careers on managing the legacy of the war found themselves facing demands for their resignation. The carefully constructed narrative that had sustained Arkan's peace for over a century was collapsing in real time. Lena watched the unfolding chaos from the Survivor Network's command center, feeling both exhilarated and terrified by what they had set in motion. The truth was finally emerging, but at a cost that none of them could fully calculate. Victor would have been proud, Thane said, joining her at the window that overlooked the crowds gathering in the plaza below. "Do you think we did the right thing?" she asked. "I think we did the necessary thing," he replied. "The truth has a way of coming out eventually. Better that it emerged through testimony and evidence than through violence and revolution." The weeks that followed were chaotic as Arkan society struggled to come to terms with the revelations. The Truth Council was dissolved, its members facing criminal investigations for their role in perpetuating the cover-up. New commissions were established to investigate the fate of the thousands of people who had been listed as missing, but had actually been murdered to preserve the peace process. Memorial services were held for Victor and the other survivors who had died defending their mountain sanctuary. They were officially recognized as heroes who had preserved the truth through decades of exile and danger. The government that replaced the Truth Council's administration declared them guardians of historical memory and established new institutions dedicated to ensuring that such cover-ups could never happen again. Lena found herself at the center of the transformation, her archaeological expertise suddenly in high demand, as investigators sought to locate and excavate the mass graves and hidden evidence that Victor's testimony had revealed. It was difficult work both technically and emotionally, but she approached it with the knowledge that each discovery brought closure to families who had waited over a century for answers. Thane won several journalism awards for his role in bringing the story to light, but he continued to focus on investigating other aspects of the cover-up. The survivor networks had revealed that Arkin's experience was not unique. Similar conspiracies had been employed on other worlds to end devastating conflicts, always at the cost of truth and justice for the victims. On the first anniversary of Victor's final testimony, a memorial was unveiled at the site of the mountain sanctuary, where he and his followers had made their last stand. The inscription, carved into stone that would endure for centuries, bore the words that had started it all: "Find me, I'm alive." But beneath that, in smaller letters that required visitors to come close to read them, were Victor's final words, transmitted in his last message before the security forces overran his position. "The truth cannot be buried forever. Someone will always be listening. Someone will always remember." As Lena stood before the memorial, watching families place flowers in honor of relatives whose fates had finally been revealed, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A simple, archaeological discovery had led to the exposure of crimes that had shaped the very foundations of their society. The peaceful world she had grown up in had been revealed as something far more complex and morally ambiguous than she had ever imagined. But it was also a world that was finally ready to face its own history, honestly. The new institutions that had emerged from the chaos were imperfect, but they were built on a commitment to transparency and accountability that had been absent from the old order. Children would grow up learning the complete truth about their world's past, not sanitized versions designed to preserve political stability. Standing in the shadow of the mountain where Victor Ashford had spent his final years, Lena understood that some discoveries change more than our understanding of the past. They change our responsibility to the future. The helmet, with its desperate message, had been more than an archaeological artifact. It had been a call to action that transcended time itself. The truth had finally been found, and with it, the hope that future generations would never again have to choose between peace and justice. In Victor's memory, and in honor of all those whose stories had been buried with them, Arkin would build a new foundation for its society, one strong enough to bear the weight of complete truth. The message carved into stone would endure, as would the promise it represented that, no matter how deeply truth is buried, no matter how many years pass, someone will always be listening, and someone will always remember.